All right, I want to go a little bit more into depth about materials and creating materials and what the elements are within a material in Unreal. So what I have here in Photoshop is I've got some examples of the different components that can go into a material to make things look as realistic as possible. First thing we have is something called a diffuse texture, and a diffuse texture just means that it is the normal everyday texture that you're going to see. That's, it's what it looks like: wood, or it looks like a rock, or it looks like a grass, or a flower, or a tree, or it's plastic, or it's metal, or it's whatever. It's the basic texture that you see that makes it recognizable as what it's supposed to be. This is a wood diffuse. That looks like old wooden plank. And it's the basic one that we use in everything. And you can create an entire world using nothing but diffuse materials or textures, but that's probably, your world's going to look really flat and cartoony, and it may not be what you want. So we usually add some additional elements into it that bring things to life. And I'm going to go through these, and I'm going to go into Unreal and then show you how they can affect the way things look. So the next one we have is the fact that when we are dealing with polygons, we're dealing with flat surfaces, regardless of the shape of it. A sphere is made up of flat surfaces. It's just in a lot of small surfaces in the shape of a sphere, but nonetheless, they're all little flat surfaces. If we're trying to texture a wall or trying to texture some boards, I can use this texture to create the appearance of wood, but it's not going to have all the little cracks and crevices that you see in here because it's a flat surface. So what we use is something called a normal map. Now, a normal map usually looks like this. There is a page inside of the Week 4 wiki pages for you to look at that explains exactly what a normal map is and how it works. Basically, it's a variation on something called a bump map, and I've talked about that in previous videos on basic intro to materials. A bump map is usually a black and white image. For example, it would look something like maybe this. It's a black and white image, and in this particular case, areas of black are recessed, and areas that are white are raised up. And what it does is it examines all of the different colors, all the different shades, and determines whether or not something should appear to have depth or appear to be raised up or extruded out of an image. Now, the difference between a bump map, again, which is a black and white image like this, and a normal map, which looks like this, and they don't really look like they would be the same thing, but they are. The main difference is there's no black or white areas on this one to say, oh, let's raise something up or let's recess something. You can see some darker areas. They're kind of a darkish purple, and you might assume, well, that must be represents the dark recessed areas. And there's some light blue areas that look like they're really light. That must be the areas that are lit up. And if you look back and forth between the two, you might assume that that's probably the case. But the difference in this is a black and white bump map, when placed as part of a material, will give the appearance of something being raised up, but when light hits the surface of an object that only has a bump map on it, the lights don't distinguish any areas that are raised up or that are recessed. When you're dealing with a normal map, what a normal map does is, because it's made up of 3 different colors, red, green, and blue, that represent X direction, Y direction, and Z direction. And what it does is a software program that creates normal maps looks at the surface and determines, okay, these objects are raised up or recessed on the X-axis, or they're raised up or recessed on the Y or on the Z. And it assigns a red, green, or blue value to that particular direction, X, Y, or Z, that an object is either raised up or recessed. And you end up with a very complex color system that looks like this. Now, what this one does is, when light hits the surface of this particular piece of wood, what it will do is the areas that are raised up will cast shadows, and the areas that are recessed will also have shadows cast upon them. So when light strikes the surface, it literally looks like it is raised up or recessed. Whereas a bump map doesn't have that level of sophistication, and it'll make it look like it's raised up, and it'll make it look like it has a shadow on it. But in reality, what will happen is you'll be able to tip it on its side and look across it and go, yeah, that's still a really flat surface. And a normal map is going to give you that illusion of having something actually raised up. So we have a diffuse, and we have the normal. This one I've been showing you as a bump map is really the specular map. And specular has to do with shininess. Now, when we get into the Unreal Material Editor, you're going to see that the shininess is really a function of three separate things. There's metallic, there's specular, and there is roughness. And all three of those things work together to make something either look metallic or plasticky or look like a mirror. And those basically are what those three things do. Specular makes something look shiny. Metallic will focus that shininess. And roughness is literally reflection. And I don't know why they call it roughness, but that was their decision, not mine. So this is specular. And what you're going to see here is areas that are white in this image are going to be shinier than those areas that are dark. Now, the assumption being that the areas that are dark are in shadow, they're recessed, and so they're not going to be catching the light like the whiter areas are going to do. So that's what's going to work out of this one. Now, another one that we commonly work with, which is also a black and white image, is something called ambient occlusion. Occlusion, in essence, the best way to think about it is dirt. Something that has cracks and crevices like this is going to accumulate more dirt in those areas than it does on a top smooth surface. So we use these a lot when we're trying to make something appear dirty or make it appear a little bit more used. You just get these little, the grimy dirt or whatever it happens to be down in these recessed areas. So this is a general material slot, the ambient occlusion, that we can do a variety of things with. If I'm dealing with this piece of wood, maybe I just want dirt and make it look like there's maybe dust and dirt and things like that down inside those cracks and crevices. What I can do is I can use this particular black and white image in a way that will allow me to separate out the black and white areas. So let's say I want the white areas to be clean, so I don't have anything necessarily attached to the white. But I can go in and say, look, the areas of this that are black, I want it to look like a dirt texture. And I can use this map in conjunction with another dirt texture to make it look like there's dust particles or dust specks down inside those cracks to try to really make that wood look old and come to life. Or, if I'm doing something like concrete, maybe I've got oil stains or maybe I've got some chips in the concrete and I want it to look like there's dirt, or take that even to an extreme further on. Maybe I have a water plane. I want the concrete to look like it has water pooled in low areas. I can use this type of map to make it look like there's water in the areas that are black. So there's a lot that I can do with ambient occlusion other than just making it look like dirt, but it's a really nice feature to have and to work with. The last one that I'm dealing with here is also a black and white image, although all of these black and white images, remember, they have to be RGB images. The Unreal Engine will only accept an RGB image. You can't bring in images that are grayscale or black and white in Photoshop. So this, while it looks like it's black and white, is really a function of a red, green, and blue channel that makes it look like it's black and white. But that's what's going on here. This one is for displacement. Now, this usually works hand in hand with the normal map, although this last one is a little bit more rare. Okay, you'll notice the areas that you have that are black and areas that are white. Much like a bump map or a normal map, this is showing you whiter areas are going to be raised up, black areas are going to be recessed. The main difference on this one is a displacement map is used to literally deform an object. Now, if you were working in Unreal and you have imported, for instance, you've created a flat plane and you wanted to bring it in and use it to do something with. or you've created a rectangular polygon that you want to put this wood texture on. If you just created a four-sided polygon, so let me do this and we'll add another page in here. If I went in and I said, look, I'm just going to create a four-sided polygon, and I went in and said, oh look, I just create a flat plane that looks like this, and I bring it in and I place it in the scene and I put on it my wooden texture and a wooden normal map, and maybe the ambient occlusion map and the specular. I get all of those things in there, so they're all part of it. Without the displacement map, it would look three-dimensional, even if I went in and actually created that as a three-dimensional object. So I went in and created this long 3D plank and brought it in and put that texture on it. What a displacement map would do in this particular case is a displacement is going to take areas that are dark and it's going to push them down, and it's going to take areas that are white and it's going to lift them up. The problem is this is the entire model. There's 1, 2, 3, there's one on the back side 4, one on the top end 5, and then one underneath it 6. There are only 6 polygons that make up this entire model. So the only thing that a displacement map can adjust is the position of a vertex. So if you look at this, these are all the vertex, and I cut that one off down there, but you can see these are all the vertices that I have. So I've got one back behind in there, I've got those 2 up here, and I've got these 2 down here. So I have a total of 8 vertices. That's what I've got. So a displacement map, this one right here, would say, look, there's the upper left-hand corner, there's the upper right-hand corner, there's the front right-hand corner, and then the front back-hand corner. So I've got those 4 corners laying down on top of that thing. What this would do is it would take an area that's darker and lift and lower it, and an area that's lighter and raise it up. But when you're dealing with something that only has that many vertices, this can only come up so far, this one can only go down so far, and you're left with you're left with very little actual changes to the way that thing works, because it just can't do a whole lot to it. So what we normally then do is we go back and we say, look, let's fill that in with this and go back to it. Let's see if I can't draw this a little bit better. So I create this basic wooden plank. Then if I go back and I cut this thing up, so it's actually made up of all of these polygons. So I would do it this way and cut it all the way down that way, and then I would go back and I would take and cut this way and this way and this way, and I would do that and cut this thing up into maybe you know, it's 90 or 100 or 200 individual polygons or more. And we'll just kind of keep going, finish that off like that, put these down here. Okay, now what happens is if I go back and I want to take that same displacement map, now I have a vertex here that can come up, I have a vertex here that can go down, one that comes up, one that goes down. And I've got all of these vertices where all of these lines cross that can actually pick up that information saying, look, this vertex right there goes up a little bit, and this vertex up here comes up a little bit more, and this vertex maybe down in this dark area goes down a little bit. Get back to that, so take those things out of there. All right, so it requires a model that's made up of hundreds, if not thousands, of polygons in order for a displacement map to work. Consequently, this is not something we use too much unless it is extremely specific. There might be something where you have to have that many polygons on it because you need to have that much detail, and a normal map just doesn't bring it to life. Now, you can see looking at this that that's probably never going to have enough vertices on it to literally make it look like it's a wooden plank, where I've got all those beautiful raised and recessed areas that you see here. I got these little, whatever those things are right there. I've got these things that are raised up. I've got some nice recesses. I've got all these little tiny cracks and crevices, and all the wood grain that you see on there. It would be just awesome if I could capture all of that and make it look literally like you were holding a real piece of wood. But it would require probably hundreds of thousands of polygons, and able to do that, to be able to do that, and that's way too much. There is a limit to what you can bring into Unreal in terms of model size. It's about 35 megs, and a model with that many polygons on it, even a piece of wood or a plank of wood like this, would probably be more than 35 megs. So it's just not really practical. So in some cases we do use these, but it's going to be a little bit rare. We won't use it as much as some of the others that we've got. So diffuse, normal, specular, and then our ambient occlusion, right? So here's what I've got. I've got another blank level that blank project that I created. I don't need any textures or anything in there because I've got it. I've brought these things in myself, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make this material so you can see exactly how it works. So the first thing I'm going to do, and this is a shortcut, you don't have to do it this way if you don't want to. You can just right-click and say, give me a material, and it will do it. But you can also right-click on a texture, and you can come up to the top and you can say, create material. And what it does is it uses that material, that texture, already built into it. So you can see I've already got my wood texture. It's already there, and it's already ready to go. All right. Now I'm going to delete this. Actually, what I'll do is I'm going to close that down, and I'm going to delete that just for a moment because I want to talk a little bit more about the this thing, because you need to understand what this is and what we're looking at. This is the material window. This is called the main material node. Everything that we deal with in all of these external programs, it all work as part of Unreal, whether we're in particle systems or whether we're in blueprints or whether we're in materials. Everything is node based. In fact, if you go to work in the industry and you're working in doing visual effects or just general CGI, everything, all the big programs are all node based, and they all work very similar. You have a series of elements that you bring in, and then you wire those nodes together to create the effect that you want. Okay, so here's how this window works. Right-clicking this window, we'll move it around like this. Okay, left-clicking, we'll select something. You can scroll in or it can scroll out. That's as far in as I can get on this particular thing. It's really handy if you have a separate monitor to put this up on, so you can just keep referring back to it without having to open it, close it, or minimize it and do those kinds of things. I do, but for the sake of videos, I don't actually use it. So there's my main node, and that's how I can function and move around in there and do stuff. Now, you notice that little window popped up. If you right-click, you're going to get a list of all of the nodes that are in the program that you can bring in. And I'm not going to pull any punches. There are probably close to 400 of them. Some of these have drop-downs of their own. There's all of these things that are in here that you can use to do a variety of things. There's landscape materials, there's gradient materials, there's texture coordinates, there's blends, there's atmosphere for doing the sky. There's math functions that are in here in terms of you want to add materials together. There's a math section. You can add materials together, or you can clamp materials so they don't go and extend beyond certain numbers, which we talked a little bit about this in the 2D game class. We used clamps when we were creating codes, and it just clamps it between two numbers. You have in here under math subtract, you have multiply, you have divide, you've got if statements, you've got maximum and minimum statements in here, you've got pi, you've got powers, you've got signs, subtract, they're all in there, along with these all these other things. And these are they're way too many in here for you to know and understand. They do so many things, and it can get so confusing so fast. So one of the things that they do that is really helpful, when you right click, the very top part up there, you're going to get something that says search. And if you're looking for something like add, and you can't remember where it is, if you just type in add, it'll come up and it'll say, it'll narrow down the list of anything that's got the word add in it, and then you can just click that and it'll add it in here. Or if you need something like multiply, you can just start to type the word multiply and it'll pop up and you've got it. And they also do something extra that goes above and beyond that, is that they do provide shortcuts. In this particular case, A, if you hold down the A key and left click, you're going to get an add. If you hold down the M and you left click, you're going to get multiply. If you hold down the D and you left click, you're going to get divide, because those are the most commonly used ones. There's another one that you're going to see and work with called a lerp. That's an L. If you hold down L, you're going to get lerp. If you need to have a texture, you want a texture image added into it, that's going to be T. So if you hold down T and left click, you're going to get a texture sample that you can bring in. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and take this. There are my main slots over here that you can see. All right, I've got an ambient occlusion slot. I have a normal slot. I have emissive color. Emissive color would be if you need something to be self-illuminated. Maybe you're dealing with a control panel on some sort of a electronic device, and you need to have lights blinking, and you also need to have lights look like they're glowing. Emissive color is where you're going to go for something like that, and I'm going to show you how those work. Roughness, specular, and metallic, those are your three shiny categories. Metallic makes it look metal, specular makes it look like plastic, roughness makes it look like a mirror. And they do have different uses, and we'll go through all of those as well. Base color is always going to be your diffuse. That's going to be your main texture. So that's kind of where we want to go there. So I'm just going to go ahead and wire this right over to that. Now you'll notice this is made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different things. And I'm getting an error because I don't actually have a picture in there yet. So maybe I need to, let me just break that so we don't do that. If you have something wired up and you want to break that, what you do is right click and it'll break that link. So it's no longer wired. Okay. When you select something, if you select the main node, you're going to get some choices over here in your detail panel. If you select the texture sample, you're going to get some choices over here again. All right. So in this particular case, let's look at the main node right here, and I want to go through some things that are over here that you need to be aware of. Right here under material, this is your display up here, your preview, and you can see it lit, you can see it unlit. You can kind of, you have the same kind of choices you have out in the main world. Perspective. You also can change it to be something else. Like if you're looking at something that you're trying to look at a texture and it doesn't really look good on a sphere because you can't see the whole thing, you can put it on a cube, or you can put it on a plane and just look at it. You can put it on a cylinder. If you'd like to see it on a cylinder, maybe it's cylindrical in shape, and that would work for you. Or what you can also do is you can also go in and say, look, I'm trying to create a texture that's going to go on a specific device. I've created a little microphone, and I have a texture that goes with the microphone. Well, you should be able to see the microphone in here to tell how your material is going to look on it. So what this last button over here does is it allows you to select the last model you have selected in your content browser. And if you go back and you click on it and then come back in here and click that button, it'll bring that actual model in here, and then you can see the texture on the actual model itself. It does not keep it there forever. It only keeps it there during the duration that this window is open, just so you know that that's what's going to happen. If you close this window and come back, it won't be a microphone model. It'll be back to the sphere. All right, now underneath that, we have our material window down here. And what this says to us is this gives us our main choices of what type of material we are dealing with. During the course of the semester, we're going to be dealing with a lot of different types of materials. And this is like when we do decals, we're going to change this to something else. But material domain is what it basically is. And it's either going to be a surface of an asset, something that's going to be visible on the outside. It's going to be what's called a deferred decal, which I'm going to cover in a separate video. It can be a light function. For example, a light function is, and I gave this as an example earlier, you have a flashlight. If you shine a flashlight on a wall in a dark room, you can see shadows of the light bulb being cast out by the flashlight. So you get this really cool visual pattern of light and shadow on the wall when you're shining a flashlight beam there. Those are light functions, and you can go in and you can create a special material and do that. Lights can project shapes and color, and that's where we go to do that. The fourth one there is a post-process. Post meaning afterwards. The post-process would be, for example, you have a scene and you put a post-process effect in there that is not visible when you're editing the game, but what happens is after the game has been built and you go in to play it, it'll do things like create like the heat blur. When you see the heat rising up off the desert, you get those little wave ripples coming up, and it looks like a mirage. You can get that kind of effect, or you can step into a post-process volume and it turns the world black and white. Those are all things that can affect that. And if you're using a post-process, then you probably want to have a post-process material to go with it so everything works correctly. So those are your 4 choices: surface, deferred decal, light function, and post-process. Most of the time, we deal with surface. And then occasionally we do decals, and very occasionally we do light functions. Okay. The blend mode. This one, you have 5 different choices here. You have opaque, masked, translucent, additive, and modulate. Opaque is what most textures are. You don't see through them. They are opaque. They're not transparent. Masked is you have a mask that will block certain areas out. And I'm going to show you in here. I've got a picture of a window, and I'm going to show it to you so I can make the windows see-through using a mask. And you'll notice over here in your main node that you have opacity and you have opacity mask. These are both grayed out right now. If I go in and said, let's do this masked, then what happens is these things change and it switches over, and now I can use an image that has an opacity mask in it, either built in or I can use a separate image as well. Translucent, if I select translucent, now I have opacity. A translucent material is generally see-through. So I have layers or levels of transparency to work with when I'm dealing with something that is translucent. Additive materials we're going to be using when we start creating particle systems, because we're going to create materials that if you have two flames, let's say you're dealing with individual flames in a fire, you have one flame that has one brightness and you have another flame that has the same brightness. When one of those flames overlaps the other flame, it should be twice as bright. And so when we're dealing with additive textures, we're dealing with materials that when one overlaps the other, they either get brighter or they get darker, or there's a change that is made somehow that way. The last one that is in here is modulate, and I'd have to look up modulate to see exactly what it does. I don't think I've ever used a modulate material, but I'm assuming that it's something that's rarely used. That's why it's last on the list, and I'll look that up and maybe talk about it in a later video. Let's go back up here to opaque. All right. The other thing that you need to be aware of in here is something called the shading model, and that depending upon what you are doing, you're going to want to know how lighting affects that, lighting and shadows. So normally we keep everything as default lit. Sometimes you have something called subsurface lighting. Subsurface would be, for example, in real life would be car paint. Car paint usually is a layer of paint covered by layers of clear epoxy or clear enamel. So light gets into it and kind of goes through the top clear surfaces and spreads out across the paint. And you get this nice glossy sheen to it. Human skin does the same thing. Light passes through skin. If you've ever gone in to a darkened room, or like say the darkened bathroom with a flashlight, and you hold the flashlight up to your hand and shine the light on underneath your hand and then look through it, you can see that your skin kind of glows pinkish, and sometimes if your fingers are thin enough, you can actually see the shadow of the bone inside of your finger. That is subsurface scattering, and you have to be able to select a material that's going to handle light in that way. You've also got pre-integrated skin there. So if you're working specifically with skin, you can do that. You have clear coat, which is another variation. Clear coat is the same thing as the paint. You have subsurface profile and two-sided foliage. What this does, two-sided foliage is really important when we start creating foliage, because a leaf has a picture of the leaf on both sides of an object, and yet you want light to pass through it and get that effect of, you can see light passing through a leaf sometimes. So you have the chance to go in and create a pre-lit a default lighting scenario dealing specifically with the type of material that you've got. Most of the time, we just stick with default lit. Now, one of the things that they do in here, not necessarily in this, but a lot of times what happens is you go in and you start tinkering. You're trying to do something, you're trying to do an effect, you're changing numbers, you're changing settings, things like that. Most of the time, and I guess not really here in this window, but certainly when you get out and you're looking at these elements out over in here, the default setting, if you change the default setting, sometimes what will happen is that particular thing will go bold. So the enable gravity, if I turn that off, that's not really making any change, but I get a little arrow right next to it. If I click it, that's good. If I do that, that's telling me either this will go bold, the text will go bold, or you'll get something like that next to it that's telling you that you have changed something, so you know. Because, again, if you're testing something out and you're just like, well, I don't know what this does, and you click the button, how are you supposed to know later on whether or not that's something you changed? Because there are a lot of things in here. All right, by default, these aren't checked. If I check them, I get that little arrow next to it saying, just so you know, that's not default. So if it doesn't work and you check that off, now you can look back and go, oh, I guess I shouldn't have done that. So watch for those types of things. Surface, opaque, and default lit. Most of the time, that is exactly what we're going to use. The translucency we don't have to get into until we're working with the translucent material. Down here, we can just select what we are using it with. By default, those are all going to work no matter what you do. You can change your materials for mobile if you need to have lower quality materials. Tessellation, what tessellation does is tessellation works with that other material that I had back over in here, which was the displacement. If you have a model that already isn't cut up to tens of thousands of polygons, what you can do is you can go in and you can say, in your material, you can say, go ahead and do a tessellation. And what it'll do is it'll take an object and it will automatically cut it up into tens of thousands of polygons and then allow your displacement map to work. We're not going to worry about that because we don't really need to. Just because I try not to do that at all costs because I don't really want models with all of those things in there. All right, so the last thing I'm going to do here in this section of the video is I'm just going to show you, if you've got something that's set up like this and you've brought in a texture sample, how do you actually get a picture on there if you haven't, if you don't already have one? Well, I've shown you in an earlier video, you can just click on something and you can drag it up, and it'll drop it in and do that. And I can take this and wire that up to my base color. If I've got one of these texture samples that's in here already and I would like to do something with it, if you select it, you'll see over here on the left it'll say texture none, and if that drop down will show you all of the textures that you have imported in your particular world. Now in this particular case I have a wood example normal map, so I will bring that in and it'll add it into there. And let's switch this over here so I'm looking at this wood because I really want you to see exactly how this is going to look when it goes in and does it. So there's that world or that piece of wood. Here's my normal map. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to wire this over to normal. And now I've got this nice recessed. It looks like it's recessed. It really looks like it's a three-dimensional object, much more so than this, which is really flat. That's flat. You can see the highlight right here of the light just bouncing off that surface. If I go in here and change that to be normal, I lose that because it's actually got some rippling effects going on. Now, I started to talk earlier about these little elements over here that you see on the right-hand side of the texture window. They stand for the red channel, the green channel, the blue channel, the opacity channel if you're dealing with an image that's got some opacity built into it. And the first one up here is basically the composite image. This is RGB all put together. And to give you an idea of what that image looks like in its component forms, let me break that for a second and say, let's look at the red channel. And you go, well, wait, that's not red, that's black and white. Well, let's look at the green channel. That's not green, that's black and white. Let's look at this. The blue channel is not blue, it's actually black and white. what those images are is they each represent, in black and white formula, how much blue there is in that image. Where you see the dark areas, the gray areas, there is blue. The darker the area, the more blue there is. The darker the area on this one, the more green there is. The darker the area, the more red there is. I'm sorry, I got that absolutely backwards. Okay, because when I talked about earlier colors, I talked about things that were subtractive and additive, RGB versus CMYK. When you add red, green, and blue together, you get white. So where you see lots of, no, that's got to be correct, because that's dark areas. Those dark areas are the cracks and crevices. I was right to begin with. Never mind. All right, let's go put this back over here and make that the same color there. Now, the normal map works the same way, except it only contains the red, green, and blue channels only contain the shadows in that particular direction. So you can really see a huge difference there. That's the normals in the red direction, which is X. Here is the Y direction, and then here is the Z direction. Okay, any of those would actually work, but if you would take all of them together and use them, it works really well. You really get the best looking image. Right, so let me bring in my ambient occlusion. I don't think you're going to see it. There's not a whole lot of ambient occlusion to that. I just wire that right into AO right here. You're probably not going to see much difference on that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here for now, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to discuss metallic, specular, and roughness. And I'm also going to talk about how you can make some basic changes to a texture if you're not particularly happy with it.